Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isha Nelson. I'm an economics and markets reporter for Quartz. I know this is the session right after lunch, so we'll try and keep it as lively as possible. I also know that Macron is speaking after us, and I would like to encourage you not to rush for the exit. That room is already quite full, but you'll be able to listen in this room afterwards. They'll have him on the screen as well, so you won't need to kind of stampede, because I think you've missed the opportunity, to be honest. Anyway, we have a really exciting panel now. The title is The Centrality of Data, a huge, broad, sweeping topic, but we're going to focus on a few things. So to start with, I mean, the obvious, there is more and more data than we've ever had before, and what's important about that is there's more and more ways that we can store data, which used to be kind of the big problem that was faced. But having more data allows for so much better policies from both governments and the private sector. There's just a huge opportunity just to provide services that people actually want and can actually use. But alongside having more data, there are issues of transparency, there are issues of privacy. Being in Europe, obviously that's an important topic at the moment, and I'm sure GDPR will be coming up a lot. We're also thinking about the ways that governments collect data for research and the ways universities collect data. But on this other side of that, we've had scandals where we're concerned about how data is being used for political purposes, something you obviously don't like to think of too much happening in Europe and other Western countries, but it's an issue all over the world, and we shouldn't forget that. We'll be thinking about new rules in terms of choice and consent of what you do with your data, and understanding who is really empowered by new changes and who maybe isn't. We'll be looking a little bit about the fact that data collection isn't actually that widespread. There are many sectors, many countries where it's expensive and difficult to store and collect data that can be used to provide these better government and private sector services. So we'll be talking about how we can make data more inclusive, make its management and storage and usage more inclusive, so that people aren't being left behind in this transformation that we're having. And then we'll be talking a little bit about data ethics, whose role it is to ensure that we're treating data fairly. And obviously we'll be thinking a little bit about what the OECD can do and is doing to ensure these subjects. So my panelists today, closest to me, I have Elena Jill Liza Swan, I promise I'll try and get that right, who's the Global Director of Big Data B2B at Telefonica. Next to Elena, we have Sebastian Soriano, the chairman of ARCEP. Best way of describing that as a telecoms regulator. Any of you from France will know them well. Next to Sebastian, we have Carla Childers, the Senior Director of Strategic Projects at Johnson & Johnson. And on the end, Frédéric Bardol, the Chief Technology Officer of Data for Good. One of the things we want to think about when we're talking about data and usage patterns, I just have a quick question for the audience. All of you who came in today and logged into the OECD Wi-Fi, how many of you stopped and read those terms and conditions before you did so? No one? Not even anyone who works for the OECD? No? Okay. Something to think about as we go through. Carl, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, having more data than we've ever had before, I want to ask a little bit about how Johnson & Johnson has been using this to work with governments, to work with the private sector internally to provide better services.
Great, thanks. And I'll start off just by explaining, those of you who saw the reference to the Yoda project leader, it's actually not a Star Wars effort. It stands for the Yale Open Data Access Project. And I just want to give a little bit of context, because I think that will set up how we've been doing a lot of those activities. So for us, the data sharing effort has been one where these are where independent researchers have had very interesting questions and wanted to use data that we've collected in clinical trials to do their own analyses. And so we have created an agreement with this Yoda project to act as the independent panel to review those research proposals and be the intermediary, if you will, between us and the requester, to ensure that the review of the proposal is fair and credible, that the intent of the research is aligned with public health benefits, generalizable knowledge, And we've worked a lot with other members in the industry to talk through the best practices in setting up these types of data sharing efforts. And for us, I think some of the hallmarks of that project have been the transparency of the process and putting metrics in place that people can actually see and see how it's been successful. We've had almost 20 publications to date result from the last 3.5 years of that data sharing effort. And it's really opened a lot of doors for us to be able to share best practices and then go and talk to health authorities about our process. And I can go into a little more detail, but just wanted to give a little context that for us, and the context I'll be speaking from is this interface between external researchers wanting to gain access to something that historically has been thought of as very protected and private. And so we've got a nice case study that we can share through the course of the panel of some of the practices and lessons learned that we've been experiencing.
Great. Elena, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how, as a telecoms company, Telefonica has always had a lot of data, but I imagine in recent years, the way the company has thought about what it does with that data and how it can be used has changed quite a lot. So in your role, it has big data in the title. How has the thinking at Telefonica changed?
Well, it has changed completely because basically I am talking about maybe 5 years ago. As you say, as a telco operator, we produce a lot of data coming from the smartphones, etc., but we were not use it, and we were not able to use it, even to storage, because it was very expensive. With the big data techniques, it has changed completely the way we take decisions in the company. Because we are able to analyze, to have the granularity and to have many more sources of information. And at the end, what happens is that we are able to better understand the needs of the customers and being able to anticipate what they need and to provide a better service. So we take decisions, better decisions, more efficient in every area of the company. I'm not talking just about marketing or about the network deployment, and even talking about finance or even HR. So it has completely changed the way of taking decisions, and I think we are a more efficient and a better company thanks to data and big data. And now we are even going and taking a step further, because we have understood that this data could be also used to provide some value to the society. So using the same data, the same security measure, the same platforms to provide and to develop some projects with NGOs and with public administration to deliver some value to the society. So it's a big change in the company.
Thank you. Well, Sebastian, I wanted to ask you about regulation, of course, being a hugely important factor when we think about data. There needs to be many eyes overseeing that and its usage. How is data being used now, not just in terms of regulating who has the data, what access they have to it, but it's transforming what ARCEP is doing? And I believe you're going to answer this first question, at least in French. So for those of you who need, now is a good time to pull out your translators. I think they're in the sides of each of the seats.
Yes, thanks a lot. So I will speak in French for this first question, so if you can use your headphones. Ce que nous croyons
Indeed, what we believe as the regulatory authority is that our influence on the market and our action on the market, our role will be more and more tenuous, more and more hampered by technological development. Let me explain. If you are a regulatory authority, well, of course, by definition, you have to work within a legal framework. So when you want to regulate anything, the first thing to do is to define the thing you're proposing to regulate, and then it is for you to have rules and regulations enacted to say what it is, what sorts of rules you propose to impose on certain industries, and then you want to enforce these rules. Now, having said all that, well, you can imagine that this takes a lot of time. Now, you know about GDPR, which on the General Data Protection Regulation. I mean, from A to Z, it took 5 years from the first outline all the way to the final conclusion. But innovation goes much faster than that. I mean, technological innovation moves so fast that you can't keep up. Regulatory authorities simply cannot keep up. They cannot respond as timely as they should in a timely fashion. So it means that we ourselves, as a regulatory authority, we have to reform the way, or to bring about a paradigm change. If you want to if you want to regulate the barbarians, you have to barbarianize regulation. You have huge challenges brought about by the digital revolution. The space that needs to be regulated is such that we have to revolutionize, we have to bring about a revolution in the very tools that we use to bring about or to create regulation. Now, among such tools, you have data. Data in itself becomes a tool that enables the regulator to be a market player, in a way, using nudge techniques, using or prompting economic players to go in a certain way, using these nudge techniques. So we bring influence to bear. I mean, we are influencers rather than just watchdogs.
A lot about how data is benefiting companies and regulators and researchers in all different capacities. But I do want to ask you, Frédéric, about the people who don't have quite as much access and what Data for Good is doing to make sure that this is more widespread than it has been in the past.
Yeah, so thank you for inviting me. What we find at Data for Good is that it's really hard for NGO and other institutions to have access to data science. For one part, because human resources are really scarce, and because they don't have the funding to do data science projects, and sometimes they don't have the culture as well. So what we do is we build data science projects with NGO, institution, or citizen which have ID, and we build project for free with volunteer. Everybody is a volunteer in Data for Good, and we build small project from 2 to 3 months to help NGO, institution, and citizen to be better with data. So maybe I can give a quick example of what kind of project we do. Right now we are working on a project called Open Electoral Map, which is based on gerrymandering. I don't know if everybody here know what gerrymandering is. It's when politicians try to find ways to cut electoral map for their purpose, and we try to open source this thing in France to see how the new cutting will influence the next political election. And we are doing that. We are opening the data, opening the source code, so that anybody can use our project and anybody can talk about that. So the aim is to make the project more public.
So this is kind of about using data to empower consumers in some way, which is what RCEP is doing in terms of its telecoms work, which is allowing people to, encouraging companies to act better by making data available to consumers, and something, I guess, similar that must be happening at Telefónica, because if there's more information available and consumers have access to more information, you'll run into trouble if you're not offering them the best and cheapest service you can be offering them. So can you talk to us, again, a little bit more about how you've had to change practices within the company to ensure that now consumers have more information than they had before, that you're offering those right services?
Well, within a Telefónica, it's very important, like several principles regarding data. As you mentioned, the first one is transparency. It's important for the end consumer to know which data are you using and for which purpose. So that's the first part. The second principle is control. The end consumer needs to decide what is the purpose of the use of the data, and they need to have the decision the power to decide which data is going to be used. And the third one, of course, is security, something that we the privacy is a right of the consumers, and as companies that need to manage this data, we need to make sure that we have all the security measures and all the privacy measures in order to keep that information private. And I think that there has been a lot of evolution in the way people are thinking about their own data. they are realizing that the data is an asset, and even that sometimes where they are getting access to free services is not for free, it's just that they are just providing data for other purposes. So I think there has been a lot of change in the thinking of the people regarding privacy. Another way where people can see what that the data can have like a good usage is the kind of services or project that we were mentioning before, big data for social good. That is the same use that the companies are doing, but we are able to help NGOs or public administrations, for instance, to improve air quality, or to anticipate and have better measures when we have like natural disasters, or understand what is how the diseases spread, or digital education. So we can put this data to work for the society. And it is another way of for the society to understand that using data is not bad. It depends on how you use it, and there are a lot of ways where it can be used for good.
From a regulator's perspective, do you think these changes are happening on their own because companies have realized, yes, we have this data, consumers have more, a bit more autonomy than they had before, or actually do you need regulators like ARCEP providing comparable information so that consumers actually feel empowered to make decisions? Not enough just to have the one company say, this is what we're doing, this is the service we're offering. You actually need those compare every other telecom company's information to be able to do that.
Yes, I think transparency is good, but not enough. And that is why at ARCEP we have given a name to the program, the policy we are putting in place with data, which is regulating with data. So which means it's not only transparency, because transparency is obliging a company to be transparent about a certain behavior. Okay. Regulating with data is, I like the name of this discussion, centrality of data, is to assume that there is a central role to a public authority, like a regulator, to gather possibly the data and then to redistribute it to the consumer. So for instance, just let's take an example. Mobile coverage information. Prior to acting in this field, every telecom operators in France was making public its own map of mobile coverage. And actually the information was not totally comparable between operators. So it was a kind of, misguiding information for consumers. So the first thing we decided is to put a norm about how the maps must be produced with several levels of coverage, and then we put this information fully comparable in open data. And the next step is how this data is operated, is used. And this is where I believe we have, as regulators, not to work alone. We have to work with the community. And so I'm really interested with the community like Data for Good, for instance, because a regulator is not necessarily the best place to invent the right way to use data to nudge the consumers. So for instance, at ARCEP, what we decided is to have partnership. So we have partnership with one application. I invite you to download it. It's QOSBEE, QOSBEE. And thanks to this application that is using data, putting on open data by ARCEP, you can have a comparison of telecom operators for your need. So this application, for instance, can follow you, or you can enter addresses where you want to know who is the best operator for you. And so it's a tailor-made information that you will be provided. And so typically this is the kind of thing that is not necessarily in the role of the regulator. So there is a role of the regulator, which is to put norms on data and to make sure that they are available. And then there is a cooperation with an ecosystem of startups or civil society, what I would call RegTech. that is needed to make this data available for end users.
I want to talk a little bit more about that point of standards within data and what's being provided, and ask Johnson & Johnson, when you're providing data between different groups of people, what are the challenges you face in ensuring that that data gets shared in appropriate ways, and who is responsible for those rules, so that you don't have a situation like what we had with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, where they thought they had rules and they thought they had standards, and that, you know, everyone ticked a box and said what they were doing, and it turned out that those weren't being followed, and they kind of realized in hindsight. Well, how do you ensure something like that doesn't happen?
So I think a couple of different thoughts there. One, I want to amplify from what Sebastian just said, that we've had very good experience in our conversations with the EMA on Policy 70 and thinking through their role as the body that can help articulate what's important for the people for whom they're responsible. And we had a really nice dialogue and stakeholder engagement where they appreciated that we, the sponsors who were conducting clinical trials with data, were the experts in how those data could be prepared and the challenges of making them public. So I think that was actually a really good example in that back and forth that happened back in 2014 of recognizing that there's a role for the regulator and policymakers while appreciating the subject matter expertise of the data holders and contributors. So I wanted to just I agree completely with that approach and philosophy. From our perspective, I think getting to what I think you're asking, Nisha, is about the integrity of the process, of making sure that what we're doing is what we say we're doing, and that there are no surprises in how the data are being used, has been really a ruthless commitment to transparency, that every aspect of how the policies were developed, how the processes were put in place, what the actual questions have been that have come in, what are the results, who's asking them, what are the metrics, how long is it taking, all of that is completely public, so that a lot of the concerns about making clinical trial data available to people from whom we wouldn't have any control was bad actors and people using the data for purposes that weren't in the best interest of society and advancing science and medicine. So what we've found is a lot of those concerns have been allayed by having an entire site where you can see every single person who's ever asked a question. They can see very fairly how their question was disposed of and responded to. And so from our perspective, that the transparency of that and the standards to which they were being applied and how they were being used has been very critical and really creating a lot of trust from both researchers, and we've also heard from patient groups that they feel confident that we are using their clinical trial data that were collected in ways that they intended when they participated in the clinical trial.
I was going to ask Frédéric on that point around who is writing these rules, and as someone who's relying on volunteers and people with certain skills to be able to do that, how do you find this process of trying to disseminate data to more groups and data science to more groups of people when there's not a coherent framework for doing that?
Actually, we have a project during this batch, during a batch that is running right now, which is called Hippocratic Oath for data science, for data-related job. And we found out that in France there is no discussion about ethics in data science. But in the US there is a lot of things happening right now with, for example, DJ Patil and Data for Democracy. They are writing a code for ethics. So we just say, okay, let's make it a project and try to see what could be a code of ethics for data-related job in France and in Europe, because we have some specificity. And so we are working on a project right now to try to define what should be the right thing to do for data-related projects, data workers. But it's a really concrete guide. It's like it starts with data collection. What should you do? What shouldn't you do? And it goes with data analysis, and then data opening data and make them public. And for each step, we have some guidelines to tell people what they should do or what they should be worried of. And this all work is also based on the law, for example, the GDPR, but also on French law, which are specifics in France. For example, administration have no choice but to open their data, and we try to build this guide for all people working with data. And we want it to be as concrete as possible, and it will be released in June during our demo day.
Very soon. Ellen, I want to come to you about on this kind of similar point of who is writing these rules, and when you have something like GDPR that comes in, and obviously the focus becomes on really big companies and what access to your data that they have and what they are doing with it. But then there's the other side of that, which is if you're a smaller company and you're asking people again to kind of agree to give the same consent. I think people are much more reluctant for smaller companies than for a bigger company where you kind of say, oh, I've been using your service for years. I'm not sure how I get around this now. So yes, click without thinking about it too much.
Well, I think what the GDPR philosophy is not about big companies or small companies. It's more about the usage of the purpose of the data, no? Because it regulates the way you can use, for instance, anonymous or pseudo-anonymous data. And in the case of personal data, you need to provide express consent, but for the usage. So you may, and actually it's happening, that you may trust a company, maybe a large company or a small company, but you don't want this data to be used for a certain usage. So it discriminates a lot, and I think it changes a little bit how people are going to start thinking about privacy. I think apart from the consent or the privacy issues, one thing that we need to couple as a society, for instance, and I think the kind of initiative that Frederick was mentioning about social good and even to have some standards, is that I think one of the barriers that we have is to make these kind of projects consistent and make it like really structured projects. No, I think we are all acting as in a best effort or trying to do our best, but we are very divided, and it's hard to evolve the model from one-offs or pilots to something that is real. Structural in the way the society or the governments are really taking decisions. And in this sense, this kind of initiative where we try to normalize or to have a certain rules that we can combine data, for instance, and is one of the key issues, not to make the things consistent and really structured, not just one-offs. No? That is what is happening right now.
Do any of you find yourselves working with companies that actually, well, obviously it's part of what you do, but Johnson & Johnson, Telefonica, that have far less access to data and getting kind of left behind in this process so much, where there is a huge opportunity to expand and grow and to kind of jump on this economic data? You know, it's been described data as being the next oil. Really, everyone just wants to get their hands on it. How do you, as big companies who are collecting data and trying to share it not only for your own good but social good, ensure that you're opening up to smaller companies wherever in the world they may be?
Meaning bringing them inclusively in to try to encourage them to share data as well, and
encouraging them to share data, but also if they don't have the actual technical tools to be storing it, to be managing it, to understand what to do with it.
Yeah, and I think probably our efforts there have been most focused on we've been working collaboratively with other industry sponsors to think about how we can create a centralized nonprofit that could, because part of the biggest challenge is academic and government researchers don't often have the funding, at least in the case of clinical trial data. So can we help support the creation of an independent body that would offer very low cost or free services and tools that they could use that are fit for purpose, whereas we have maybe the resources to partner with other organizations. So we've been investing a lot of sweat equity in helping that nonprofit learn from what we've done and sharing best practices. So I think that's one direct effort that we've been making. And then also just continuing to partner at a lot of the trade associations where we've been sharing best practices, publishing what we've been doing, trying to share what we've done and what we've learned so that we're not just keeping it to ourselves.
If I may add, another thing that I think is very critical in that is, as we say, and we already mentioned, the skills. To have the right skills in the companies is one of the bottlenecks to growth. And we are putting a lot of effort in the countries where we have presence in collaborating and having like training and even showing the things that we are doing, so the smaller companies have also access to to the skills, to the data scientists, data engineers, data architects, so to train the companies to make sure that they have access and the right skills in their companies, I think is one of the critical aspects.
Imagine skills is very important. Obviously, Frederick, if you're using people who are coming to you already with those skills, expansion must be difficult when you can't go to. So, for example, the product with the elections, gerrymandering in France, requires people with that political knowledge, but also with the technical knowledge to produce this kind of data. How do you work in areas where it's harder to come by people with those skills already? Do you have any initiatives around training, or do you speak to other companies around training people?
At the beginning, we made a mistake. We thought that with just data scientists, we could make great projects, and it was a total failure. You know, some people were just presenting Python notebook to conference, and it was really boring, really boring. So we try now to build a more complete team. So we have now designer, policymaker, and designer, UX designer inside the team, and also developer. So our projects are more are really better because the team is well-rounded. We are really lucky because we don't have to fight to attract people. People come at us because they like what we are doing, and so we don't have this kind of problem. Just with a mass of words, people come at us, and we have a community of 3,000 people who just are ready to work on projects. And one thing we are good at is to be super lean. I mean, we are only volunteer at Data for Good. No one is paid, and we just have a budget, or I don't know, few 300 euro per year. So we are very lean, and all of our resources are from volunteer who pay Wikipedia style, just donation from people. So we are totally independent. And I think people from this generation are really sensible to this, to see that they are doing these projects for good, but also the structure of the NGO itself is horizontal, and everybody has the same status. So we try to keep it that way, and it's really important for us.
I think with Asep, the design of data and how you're presenting that to people must be is almost as important as management and collecting of data. Is then how do you present that back to people and do you use it in particular ways? I mean, maybe we could talk a little bit about how, since you've started trying to use data to encourage companies to do more, how design has played a role in that.
Yes, to broaden a little bit the picture. I mean, we can assume that we are in a world where the market is taking a place that is growing, okay, and we rely on competition to make sure that market failures are limited and that everybody can access to products and services. And in that frame, something that is becoming critical is the ability of the consumer to choose, to really choose without bias. And I really believe this is a rising question, and this is at the heart of the book Nudge, you know, from Thaler and Susten. It's about how you make sure that people are getting in the right direction when they choose. And so I think that we regulators have to intervene in what we could call the architecture of choice, to make sure we don't want to decide at the place of people, but we have to guarantee that the choice is really open. So one example of that, but it's not with data, but because data is not only the solution, is net neutrality. So for instance, we assume that networks must be neutral, so that it's only the end user that are choosing the services at the end. But sometimes just intervening on the architecture of choice can be sufficient to influence the market and to make sure that people are getting in the right direction. But to make this possible, you have to get the right information. So the really basic function is to get the information in the hand of the regulator. And as I mentioned, second step is to get partnership with companies, startups, services that are able to to help and to empower users to make the right choice.
I think what you described there as well is a fine line between encouraging people to share more data and to have that data be used to encourage them to make good decisions, but also people, I think, are in fear of feeling like they're being manipulated by the data that they've made available and realizing that it's been collected from different sources. And even if you consented each individual one, there's a lot of, I think, public learning to do about what that data means. I want to ask you all a little bit about what organizations like the OECD and others can do to encourage more sharing of data, but that still protects privacy and makes people still feel empowered and like they're getting the benefits of it without so many of those downsides.
Well, first, one thing, and I really like the approach that Sebastian was telling us, is lead by example. So I think this kind of thing of using data in their own organization to take decisions, so to become a data-driven public administration, I think is a very good way to start. Specifically in the case of the OECD, since it is a supranational organization, I think there is a lot of things that they can help the countries and the companies to evolve in this environment of digital transformation. That is a really broad topic. I think one of the things that can help the countries is to assess where they are, where are the gaps of the companies, since they have like the global view. Help and share the best practices and the things that they have worked in other countries, and this is something that can be very, very helpful. And of course, to help them have a plan and even monitor how the countries or the companies are evolving towards this mission. So I think it's a very critical role, and I know that they are starting to do this. But I think it's a great help for the countries.
Question?
Yes, I mean, as a regulator, I would love to have a kind of, best practices about how we regulators make sure that the architecture of choice is getting is okay, or how to improve it on specific markets, so that we are sure that there are the right incentives in the market. Of course, this question is a little bit more complicated in markets where there is no competition. So this is obviously not the case in the telecom sector, at least in France, where there is good competition, and I think ARCEP has a role with it. But I mean, the real challenge when we will, when regulators on a more broadly consideration will have to deal with big tech, for instance, is that on the one hand, it is difficult with big tech to impose them specific behaviors because, as I mentioned, because of fast-moving innovation. So the classical way to regulate market players is sometimes difficult to put in place with big tech. But on the other hand, if you only regulate them with data without competition, if there, I mean, sometimes there are monopoly. Or, I mean, big dominance, then if you cannot influence the consumer's behavior, it's getting complicated. So the kind of toolbox that regulators may use to influence the markets, taking into consideration this competition question, could be of help, great help.
From my perspective, I think it's probably the OECD continuing to do what they've been doing, at least in this area from our perspective, which is reaching out to companies and industries like ours that have been wrestling with this for quite some time now and thinking about possibly leveraging some of the core principles I think that we've been talking about and some of the experiences that really fall out into the three buckets from my perspective. Of it is a very healthy respect for the role of the regulator in whatever industry that you're looking at. And I think that's been borne out in the healthcare industry by appreciating the role of the health authorities and making the assessments about the investigational medicines. And that's proven to then create a very positive relationship between the industry and the regulator to co-create systems and policies that make sense. It's also been very importantly, and I think you alluded to that, Sebastian, the preserving the innovative space and an appreciation that you have to continue to preserve the incentives to innovate and bring, in our case, novel therapies to patients and healthcare providers. So getting everyone on board with the fact that you do need to have that preservation of innovation. But then most importantly, from our perspective, has always been consideration of the patient and incorporating the patient and the healthcare voice into shaping what that system looks like, because I think it can be easy sometimes to forget to include that very important voice and make decisions on their behalf. And what we've been very clear about doing in our process, and what we've been doing, is always going back to the stakeholder and trying to understand, is this working for the researchers who want to get access to our data? Are healthcare providers actually using the information that's come out of the efforts we've put into it? And do patients believe that we're doing this in a way that is productive? And so I think OECD could, and they have already reached out, and I think continuing to do that and try to learn would be fantastic.
I think we should go a step ahead from data and to start to think also about algorithm which use this data, because it's really important. For example, when you have all these platforms that use a recommendation system, I think they are great. For example, when Spotify recommend me music, or Netflix recommend me movie, it's great. But when YouTube or Twitter or Facebook is recommended me politics article, or maybe some crazy video of some extremist videos, I think we have a huge problem with that, and it's really not simple to solve, because the algorithm that suggests this content is just doing the job perfectly. Its objective is to optimize watch time or the time spent on the platform, because we are in an attention economy, and people should spend a lot of time on the platform to be shown ads. But if you want this algorithm to perform, you have to show them the most addictive content, and we have a great addictive problem with a big platform. And some people say, okay, it's not a platform's fault, because it's a human behavior to be addictive to this stuff. But if you look, if you have a metaphor, it's like a canteen for children, which is serving dishes, and it's run by an algorithm. And one day the algorithm tried to make the dishes more salty and more fatty. And the kids are really enjoy it. So the next day it's more fatty and more salty as well. At the end, you only eat really bad food. And it's really the same thing with this recommendation algorithm. They have found our default, and they try to engage with that just to maximize the ads we are shown.
And that's an important point in terms of, as you use more and more data is available, who are the companies that are benefiting from this next level, from having the big data analytic tools, from having AI, and that's not as widespread as, say, the companies that just have the access from the data they're collecting, or that can be provided from other companies, which is your name and your email address and maybe what you watched on Facebook. But it's not quite that same level of, there's more concerns around the ethics, as you say, of such things. I'm going to invite Dirk Play from the OECD. He's the Deputy Director for the Science, Technology and Innovation, to talk a little bit more about what the OECD is doing, and then there'll be some time for questions. I think you can either log in to Bcast and submit your questions that way, or you can do it the old-fashioned way and just raise your hand, and I'll try and get questions around that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha, and really, I've really great debate. I think it really shows a little bit how important data has become. I think if we would have had the same discussion only about 5 years ago, a lot of people, it would have been a very different discussion. I think this is something which is really now only reached a little bit the limelight. I think we're now really starting to look at data. We are trying to understand really what it all means. And we're still trying to catch up, I think, to some extent as well. I think policy, in many cases, is, I mean, if you're looking at privacy guidelines, those were many cases developed in the 80s. There was no internet, there was no big data. Now we're really trying to reconcile the fact that we want to protect privacy, at the same time we want to use data because it has so many possible benefits, and I think some of the examples we heard here really show that. I think we're also, this is moving so incredibly fast, and that's the other problem, I think, from a policy perspective, which we're seeing at the OECD. that it is very hard for policymakers to catch up with the speed at which things are moving. And I think that's an issue which we need to deal with. I think one of the lessons I've learned from what you were talking about is really to try and strike that balance. On the one hand, we do see the benefits, but there are also things we need to do to try and make sure that we do this in the right way. I think the big issue, the word was trust. And that has many dimensions to it. I think it has dimensions of privacy, of security, of protecting consumers, of transparency. Also, I think showing the benefits for society. I think some of the points which were made on that in the end, I think really show as well. There are so many potential things which we can do here with data, but we need to try and get that right. I think another point which I think was very important in the discussion was the issue of capabilities, of skills, of basically this is still very hard for many firms. This is still very hard for many companies to do. We're doing some work at the moment at the OECD on artificial intelligence. We're trying to dig in a little bit on that. And if you're basically looking who's involved in that, at the moment, these are the big platforms that are doing most of the investments in artificial intelligence. And then there are lots of startups who are basically often linked to these platforms and trying to sort of get into those platforms. So it's a very limited number of firms that are doing this and basically really involved in it. And I think we need to try and make sure that we broaden that experience and get others involved. Let me say a few words about, perhaps one other point before I say a little bit about what the OECD is doing is partly that not all data is the same. I think a lot of the discussion we had here is probably around data which is very much personal data, which is very much because of course, that's where most of the sensitivities are around. But there are also lots of other data that are being collected and where sometimes some of the issues are not the same. So I think we need to look at a little bit at that continuum of data and try to look a little bit in more detail. Few words about the OECD work. We're doing a lot of work on access to data, trying to see, well, how can we broaden the use to provide better access? That is about research data, it's about public sector data, and then there are questions about how you go further on that. And I think some of the examples, particularly from Johnson & Johnson, about basically how you can also provide access to data in a responsible, in a proper way to data that is being collected in the context of clinical trials, I think is a great example of that. We've done a bit of work on that as well. We actually, last year, we put out a recommendation of the OECD on health data governance, is really trying to see, well, how can we do it in the space of health data? Because, of course, that's one of the most sensitive areas to work on. We're doing a lot of work around privacy, security, trust. I think the whole issue, the whole range of things which we need to look at there is really important, and we need to make sure that we update some of these things. We're doing work on artificial intelligence because I think that's really the next step, the next phase to some extent. Really, I think, exciting and interesting to look at, but again, it raises lots of new issues. And I think Frederic at the end spoke about profiling, some of those issues which are threats and problems and bias and algorithmic transparency and things like that, which are really important to look at. We didn't talk a lot about trade. I think there are trade dimensions here as well, but it's a bit of a different discussion, which is important. One thing I really appreciated as well from some of the points which Sebastian made is the point about nudging. What I think is important in this space is that we're still developing policies. We're trying to think about what it all means, how we do it. And there is a real risk here that we regulate too quickly, that we regulate in a way that we stifle the innovation. So we need to try and find a balance. On the one hand, be flexible, thinking about what we want to achieve, but do it in a way that we basically set the principles, that we set a little bit where we want to go, but without sort of regulating it too heavily, because we might sort of stifle some of the opportunities. And I think that's hard to find that balance, but I think that's where some of the experimentation and some of the policy development in countries at the moment is looking at. So I think one of the things I hope we can do is really learn, spread good practices, learn from each other, and I think that's also where the forum always plays a very interesting and helpful role to bring in some of those ideas and practices, because this is still an area which is developing so quickly that we all need to learn and look around and learn from each other, because nobody's really figured this out. We definitely haven't, and I think we need your help as well to make this work. So let me end it there. Thank you.
Thank you. So there's a question. There's a question on BCOST around jurisdiction and how can you have national policies at a time when data is often global, and well, the digital economy is really could be quite global. But I want to kind of broaden that to the point of, is there enough international cooperation to ensure that you have as you mentioned, regulation that allows innovation but also encourages competition and doesn't stifle new companies from being involved? And so how can you, in order to make sure that you're not trying to do everything within each country? I mean, we saw GDPR for the most part, obviously widespread across Europe, but there were organizations outside of Europe that just couldn't figure it out and essentially just said, okay, we're just going to shut down our website to European users. How do we kind of improve regulation and laws within data that fit a global world? Carly, you go first and then...
I mean, this is a real challenge, and I think that the answer is not the same for any subject, because obviously, as I mentioned, one of the limits of the public authorities that want to intervene on the market today is innovation, because it's fast-moving. And the second one is worldwide footprint of market players, of course. One country that raised one day saying, I want to regulate this guy, but unfortunately, his servers are in another country, so it's quite kind of complicated. So that's the other factor that makes that it's becoming really hard for regulators to intervene in markets, clearly. So the best, of course, would be that at global level we can reach agreement. But let's be honest, I mean, there's a question of maturity on the subject. Even at European level, a subject like privacy, it exists from a long time ago. I mean, we have a directive from 1995. We have in France an authority from 1978. So we have maturity on privacy. So we can reach an agreement at European level. On net neutrality, same thing. I mean, we are regulating telecom networks from a long time. So we can reach an agreement on net neutrality quite quickly. But there are other subjects where there is no maturity. And so that's for getting agreements at European level. And then there's the rest of the world. And, and here there are questions not only on maturity, there are questions of sharing values. There are questions of possibly competition questions, trade questions that make that it's kind of hard to reach agreement. So on the one hand, I would say yes, we have to try to find solution at international level. But on the other hand, we have to be not naive about the fact that it's going to be difficult, and so that we have to imagine a more agile way of acting, like regulating with data.
I agree completely in the complexity part, and just from sharing information or publishing information about clinical trials that health authorities have had. The EU obviously led the way with EMA Policy 70 that made public clinical trial documents, and then you saw a lot of interest come up from other regions. First, we even saw Health Canada, who has generated guidelines and regulations, and then we even saw the start of this year with the FDA transparency pilot. So what we as an industry have been trying to do is, because when asking the regulators, could you work together to try to come up with one way so we don't have to create 6 different versions, there's a healthy appreciation on our part that they are beholden to different stakeholders, different laws, different values. And so where we've tried to influence is we've tried to share best practices and learnings and educate them on the complexities that they might create if they aren't in-depth subject matter experts about data and privacy and these things. And so we've tried to influence standards and approaches to anonymizing data and trying to generate maybe consistent understandings around how to approach preparation of information, so that even if we have to prepare things differently perhaps in a particular region, that what the information that's being shared is ultimately consistent, so that we're not creating confusion and complexity by having multiple data sets or multiple versions of data. So we've had a very, by cultivating good relationships, being very willing to share with the health authorities and regulators, we're hoping to influence the standards by which the data at least are shared and released, so there's consistency.
Is there any questions in the room? I've got one hand here, and then we'll take both. So if we go to you first and then you after, sir.
Hello, everybody. My name is Vladimir. I'm from Germany, and I'm the Strategy and Business Development Manager of Centrality, a startup, a fast-growing startup that turns unstructured data, like text, into structured data using AI and knowledge graph technology. And my question is, how could startups like ours contribute to actually develop or contribute to effective policy making or solving problems in terms of data privacy. Thank you.
We'll take the next question at the same time.
Languages of big company, languages of startup, or data science, or traditional industry language. So to get such kind of key person as a human resource, circulation of people is critical, I think. So not only the free flow of data, but also the free flow of human resources is also needed. So to enhance such kind of saturation of human resources, what should we prioritize, or what kind of role of government, or if there's any opinion, I want to listen to that. Thank you.
Did you all hear that on the panel? I can repeat a little bit.
I have just quick words for both of the question. First one, at Data for Good, we are opening a new branch, and we are trying to open Bloom branch all across Europe, and we are always welcome to. We always welcome a new volunteer to build project with, so we can discuss about it later. And for the other question, I think an important thing to bring data scientists to a company could be to allow them to volunteer during their time at the company. For example, I don't know, Airbnb does that. We have a slot in their week when they can do a volunteering project. I think it can be a good practice to help people work on things they care, and also to change your company image, maybe. So,
if I may complement the non-for-profit with a company, I think the startups' role in all this AI and then innovation is becoming critical, because I think the big companies or the large companies have realized that we cannot do innovation by ourselves, and we are working in an open innovation, collaborating with a lot of startups in different, because it's impossible to touch everything that is coming in innovation. So at least in Telefonica, we are collaborating very, very actively with very specific startups that are doing this kind of work. Regarding the HR, I'm going to tell you our experience. When we first started, we also tried to find the unicorn, a person that was data scientist, knew the business, knew how to communicate. What we have learned is that it's very hard to find these kind of profiles, and even when you find it, the possibility that he's going to go somewhere else is very high. So what we are trying is to have like a longer term strategy, like training people, and even to combine different profiles. So you have people that is more technical oriented, while you have other that are more business translators. So it's very hard to find everything in the single person. And I think from our experience, it's better try to diversify and to have profiles more oriented towards one end or the other. But good luck, because it's true that it's not easy, no?
I guess with like all things, it comes down to skills and training and retraining, obviously a topic very important to the OECD. I think on that note, we'll wrap up. I'd like to remember you can stay and watch the keynote speech in here if you'd like to. And I'd also just like to thank the panel, Elena, Sebastian, Carla, and Frederic, and of course, Dirk, for doing the roundup at the end. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, I saw you ask the question. Yeah, I love it.